Karen McDonald-Gale, the Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. She has over 20 years experience in environmental project design and grant making, and Karen is a regional leader in the Conservation Trust Fund management. A Jamaican national, she previously served as the CEO of the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica and has worked with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the United Nations Environment Programme in the Caribbean. As the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund's Conservation Finance Programme Manager, Karen has also been managing the CBD's endowment fund and coordinating the development and continued consolidation of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. So we can't wait to hear her words of wisdom with us. So Karen will be giving us an overview of the development of the Blue Economy Agenda and conservation financing, including Rio +20, the Sustainable Development Goal 14, and the United Nations Oceans Conference. So thank you, Karen, and welcome. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I am very honored to be part of this course and to be able to contribute. As you heard, my background is very much on the side of the conservation financing in terms of the agenda and the discussions for today. But I think this initiative is definitely a worthwhile one for discussion. And I think I will be sharing much more of the practical side of Blue Economy discussions that have gone on so far. And I think the challenge that we have is to figure out and think about the role that some of the other players in the field, in particular in this case, academia, have to play in moving forward a Blue Economy program and proposal and way forward for the Caribbean region. So with that, let me see if the technology will go in my favor. Okay, so with all introductions already done, again, I'm very pleased to be here and to tell you more about the Blue Economy. And I can now take these off because my screen is further back for me. And my discussion today will be on the overview of the development of the Blue Economy Agenda. And of course, as you've heard, my focus is in the Caribbean region. That's where I have worked my entire life and where my area of focus is. And in particular, to think more of the Blue Economy beyond the theoretical objectives of what we want to do with Blue Economy and what's possible with Blue Economy or ocean economies. To start to think about sustainable Blue Economy industries in all that we've been doing and all that we do, whether in regular life or in the work that we are doing in the industry and in the environmental sector. We move from the more general concepts to those that make sure that this aspect of the work that we're looking at is sustainable. And therefore it thinks about providing social and economic benefits for current and future generations, looking through some of the ecosystems that we'll be working with, and of course thinks about renewable energy and material flows. And for those of you who have seen this definition, the part that I did not have in the screen speaks to the fact that it does not include energy, fossil-based energy sectors, etc. So most of the countries in the Caribbean are in a precarious economic position with a high dependency on imports, including food security, and continued resilience on a limited number of major export products. The high debt to GDP ratios reduced ODA, which is overseas development assistance, as some countries have graduated, and their vulnerability to economic shocks, such as natural disasters, add to this context. The region has been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the IMF estimates that the economic activity in the region fell by 9.9% in 2020, which is higher than the contraction of the overall region, the Latin American Caribbean region, which was at 6.8%. We know that the Caribbean is tourism dependent in terms of its economies and are also expected to take a while for that to recover, even though some of us have seen really good results in the beginning. And this high dependency really has led to the discussion that we are on today. The role that the marine environment and their resources can play in the environmental development and environmental best practices for development of the countries. To develop a sustainable blue economy that offers opportunities for economic diversification, new sources of revenue, economic growth, and employment creation is a priority for most Caribbean countries. Ocean natural resources have the potential to make a tremendous contribution to poverty reduction and to shared prosperity for the countries that we operate in the region. And as I said, there is a definition for sustainable blue energy, which is on the screen. And of course, it then means that we are not talking by means of this definition of non-renewable extractive industries such as offshore oil or gas or deep sea mining. So that gives you some of the context of what we have been thinking about in terms of what makes a blue economy for the Caribbean region. In terms of development, which we were asked to talk about, you will see in this slide that there is the idea of blue ocean relevance projects and ocean relevant policies that started some time back and is now developing at a much more rapid pace, as you will see, and as courses such as this emphasize. The idea that what we are doing in the oceans, in particular in our exclusive economic zones, is important and needs to be managed, is something that has come to a reality for the globe, the world as a whole, but in particular for us as small island developing states, who in most cases have EEZs that are at least matched, if not surpassed, by in terms of the marine area of the space. And then, of course, to talk about the Caribbean region and what's important to us in terms of blue economy and possibilities. They're listed here, the possible benefits that we have from the ocean economies, the added thoughts of what we can make use of in the space for the Caribbean economy. In terms of tourism benefits, the coastal and marine ecosystems are, of course, vital to any tourism sector. In particular, in the Caribbean, we focus on that tripod of sun, sea, and sand, supporting at least 2.8 million jobs in the region and representing 15% of total employment. And as we mentioned, this was, of course, a major factor with the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was a great change in the figures and the employment records just from the effect of tourism alone in the region. The Caribbean's marine coastal resources, their beaches, coral reefs, mangroves, fisheries, and wildlife are indispensable assets for the tourism sector. At the regional level, across boundaries, tourism entities have made important contributions to marine conservation, including some of the Caribbean hotel industries, Caribbean hotel and tourism industry, etc. But there is still a real question of asking how we balance the value of the tourism product with the ecosystem services afforded to it by the ocean economies of the world. And of course, in particular, coral reef ecosystems contribute what's been estimated at nearly $10 billion per year to the economies of the region. According to the World Resources Institute, which also states that annual loss in net revenues from tourism due to coral reef degradation in the Caribbean is estimated at about $100 million. So again, the real look at what a coral reef economy is, there are some papers which are in the reading list, which really start to ask the questions of the value of the coral reefs and how we can make sure that we are getting that value in what we are doing and the work that we are doing on the ground in the countries. We also have, and I know that the next speaker will speak more about the fisheries benefits, and I'm sure you'll have other speakers. But region-wide, the fisheries sector employs over 200,000 persons, directly or indirectly, who are often from rural communities that lack other income earning opportunities. For these coastal communities, small scale fishing is a major source of revenue as well as food and food security. And in addition, some 100,000 persons work in the processing of and marketing and sales of fish and fish products. And I'm sure those numbers are well underestimated because it's a sector it's been very hard for us to get very concrete numbers on the value of the fisheries sector and the fisheries economies and livelihoods to the fisheries sector. But overall, the activity brings approximately $1.2 billion annually to the region. Then there are the ecosystem services that we have a much harder time, and I know that you've had some discussions on the value of the benefits of just having coastal protection and shoreline protection. Some of this has come up in terms of reef insurance, and I saw where you will be having some further discussions on insurance and insurance products. But the region's marine and coastal resources provide green infrastructure that protect coastal communities and build infrastructure against erosion and storm events, and of course, particularly also help with flood control and flood damage. And strong empirical evidence now links healthy coral reefs, mangrove ecosystems with strengthened coastal resilience and adaptive capacity for coastal communities. So while mangroves are among the most effective at protecting the coasts in storm conditions, the question is that how are we making sure to protect them, and how are they being considered in the economic discussions that we're having? Together, live corals, seagrasses, and mangroves supply more protection services than any individual habitat or any combination of two habitats. And studies show that healthy coral reefs provide reduction of wave energies of up to 75%. And healthy mangroves and ecosystems can reduce wave height by up to 66%. So real numbers of the effects that you can have with healthy coral reefs and mangroves, and the question of how we make sure and cost those benefits and put a value on those benefits has come up. There is, of course, also the growing area of carbon storage and sequestration. Coastal ecosystems, including the mangroves, tidal marshes, etc., create particular areas of carbon sinks. They sequester and store more carbon in their soil, which is blue carbon in this case, per unit area than terrestrial forests. So this is newer technology that we've been hearing about. And the question again becomes, what are we going to do with this ability of these vegetated ecosystems to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And how are we going to make sure that that is valued efficiently in a system systems we're going to consider blue economy factors? And finally, the area of shipping. As the Caribbean, we have 351 ports, we have 16 oil refineries, we have 51 tanker terminals, and over 15 types of ships transiting through the Caribbean region. We are indeed a port and developing logistics hub for transatlantic, transboundary, transcontinental travel. And we need to think about what those services cost and what they provide in terms of benefits and economic value. Services are provided to international shipping lines and as well to the, of course, in this informal schooner sector, yachting sector, which is most active in the Leeward and Windward Islands. So we have here a range of the benefits that we are observing in the region, and we want to talk a little bit more about what's possible and what that means. And this takes me to a little more of my area of focus, which is on the idea of financial tools for revenue generation and the use of that revenue in particular for conservation management. We will go into a little more detail, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of the tools, some of which I'm sure you've heard about in the sector, in the area, some of which are very specific and can be made very specific to blue economies and the ocean scenario in particular. We recently heard of a debt for nature swap through the Barbados government and the issuing of bonds, specifically blue bonds. And the idea that this will provide income for opportunities in conservation in region. So just to give you an idea of some of the work that we've done in terms, and this is work from colleagues in the field of conservation finance that have looked at the ease of implementation, what's possible versus the impact it will have, and the revenue it can generate, and this is where this diagram has come from. And yet we will talk a little bit more for the specific Caribbean region. In terms of what we have been doing at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, we've tried to think and focus on what's possible in the Caribbean region for funding. And some of you would have heard some of these terms for the Caribbean scenario, and I will discuss them a little bit more going forward in a little while. And if there are any that come up that you have not seen, please let me know and we can discuss at the appropriate time. I wanted to make sure and spend some time on conservation trust funds. So the acronym CTFs will be used a lot going forward. Conservation trust funds emerged somewhat from the Rio process in that when the idea of figuring out how debt for nature swaps were going to be undertaken came up, the question of the use of or the creation of sustainable financing systems also came up. And the concept that was generated was the creation of these conservation trust funds, which are, as this diagram shows, really facilitators of a range of different abilities. So and it's one of the factors that we are proudest of as conservation trust funds, that we consider first the national interest, national priorities, the sustainable development goals that you would have heard about, and all those other factors in terms of government priorities and national priorities. We utilize that as the basis for deciding on our areas of strategy and focus. That aspect of work. The aspect of our work has to do with being able to facilitate bilateral, multilaterals, private sector, other entities that are trying to work on ideas for making an impact in countries in the region. And the idea of conservation trust funds is that we are independent, autonomous, and flexible organizations that are able to consider and design mechanisms that help to support offsets. For example, endowment funds, which I will talk a little bit more about. The idea of a space for the debt for nature swaps and where they can go in the region is another concept that has come out of the conservation trust fund industry. And the concept is that we are long-term funders that are independent, but related and working closely with government entities to create the field conservation results that we want to see in our countries, working with, again, the on-the-ground CBOs and NGOs, academia, government agencies, and protected areas. So taking the funds, investing or using or creating the opportunities for the use of the funds, and then getting those funds on the ground in the various countries to work and objectives that we want to see achieved. And in particular, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund was designed and established in 2012. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary with a vision that focused not only on the natural environment, also on people thriving. So the dual focus of livelihoods and natural environment, but with a concept of continuous funding. And that moves us away from the idea of grants to programs, the idea that funding is secured and flexible enough to be utilized for long-term efforts and not single results is something that's really important. Conservation trust funds are private, legally independent institutions that mobilize resources from diverse sources and direct these resources primarily through grants to multiple nature conservation programs. They do not directly implement conservation projects. They really aim at creating the mechanisms and creating a suite of financing opportunities for local and indeed, in our case, regional opportunities. Across the globe, there are now counting over 110 conservation trust funds. And within the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, which I will tell you a little bit more about now, we are currently at 11, counting CBF, national conservation trust funds, 10 of which are national conservation trust funds and the regional's Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. And a quick overview of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. We have the funding that we receive from our various donors, and we have 3 major programs. These are our Starship projects, but the programs are in climate change, conservation finance, and the newest one is nature-based economies and focused on ecosystem-based adaptation. And we have an endowment fund, which we operate, and we have a new just signed circular economy facility that will begin to look at options for the circular economy. And we work through national funds as well as other regional and national partners, as you see listed there, some of the ones that have been mentioned before, to really try and create these mechanisms for finance that can work and be continuous and survive in perpetuity throughout the region. Just to quickly give you an idea of the value of the architecture, the idea really behind it is the flexibility of a structure that can receive funding from a range of funders, donors. We are independent and we operate independently, even within those national conservation trust funds that were set up in support and with partnership with the governments of the region. They are indeed independent, with boards of directors that have on them a majority of non-government members, but also are operating in terms of their own independence and having government players involved. The idea of economies of scale is one that I will go back to, but it's very important for the Caribbean region, the idea that we are not operating singularly in the small islands, developing states, but we are trying to find a way to work regionally on some of the concepts that we are promoting here and that we would promote under a Blue Economy facility. So I am going to go ahead, and again, if you have any questions on the architecture, please be sure to let me know. But to show you quick some of the countries that we do have national conservation trust funds in, that CBF agreement that you see mentioned is through the CBF endowment. We have an endowment where the interest from that endowment is apportioned to 10 so far national conservation trust funds who are receiving regular payments for their operations and for their grant making on the ground. You will also see where we aim and we push, in fact, the national conservation trust funds to develop and come up with non-CBF funding to match and to indeed exceed the work that the funding that is being received from the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. So the concept of the National Conservation Trust Funds is really a big part of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. And we really think that it is what will help us to think through some of the new ideas coming up in terms of Blue Economy and make them useful and scalable for the Caribbean region. Just to give you an example, we have recently submitted to the Global Environment Facility Blue Economy Finance project that will be looking at nature-based economies in the region and trying to find innovative, again, our focus, innovative finance mechanisms. But you will see in the colored sections that we are also trying to make sure to consider some of the other factors for the specificity of the Caribbean region, the fact that we need a regional platform, and I think this would have been discussed for Blue Economy, and we need new ideas for long-term financing for the blue economy concepts that are coming to the fore. And there is space, and the CBF certainly continues to try and figure out ways of replicating the work that we are doing. And I thought I would give you some examples of what we have come up with already. We have under the program, under the finance preparation project that we did, we started to ask in the region, we asked the stakeholders about areas of blue finance that were feasible, blue economy projects that were feasible in terms of low-hanging fruit, because as much as we've said otherwise, the idea, we are starting through a project, and therefore these concepts have to be ready for the picking, as they would say. So you will see here a list. I won't go through all of this, but just to show you in the second column to the left, some of the projects that we came up with: a blue carbon facility, a technical assistance facility, a marine protected area special purpose vehicle, the use of tourism enhancement funds, which exist in a number of countries in the Caribbean, but in very different approaches, the idea of corporate social responsibility and their possible contribution to blue economies, and the ideas of financial products such as a digital payment app or a blue credit card. And what we did was to ask a range of questions on the potential impact and the potential risks for those finance mechanisms, those practical blue economy solutions. And you will see on the final right column where that was narrowed down to a quote unquote top 3, certainly where we would start our thoughts of what was possible for designing the practical approach to a blue economy mechanism. And I'm again not going to go through this in detail, but to say to you that a lot of work was put into it to make sure that we considered the factors that were relevant in all of them, in particular, this concept of a CBF blue carbon facility that begins to think about who the off-takers are of blue carbon in the region and who are involved in blue carbon trade and know the market well. The role that the CBF can play with our national conservation trust funds in that process. And of course, back to making sure that we are getting work done on the ground in terms of projects for grant making. So you will see that there is a lot of information and thought on how we would go about this process, but we do think it is feasible, and it will be investigated further under the Bluefin project, which we expect will start in the next year. I also wanted to mention the idea that we have been working on very closely with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and I know that Lench Ferrier will present in much more detail on this, but just to say how excited we are that the CBF is also working with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States on the concept of blue biotrade, which has already begun with Queen Conch, trying to figure out the value chain assessments that are around Queen Conch, the actions that need to be undertaken to make sure that there are benefits in the Queen Conch sector, and then to think about other such blue economy products in the region, including Caribbean sea moss, sargassum, and mangrove honey. So I hope that gives you a good idea of the work that we do from day to day, the ideas of how it links to the blue economy. We, of course, also make these representations in terms of our thoughts and how we are able to speak and play an ambassadorial role for the Caribbean on issues such as blue economy, ocean financing, ocean economies, and how they come together. And I think one of the interesting factors that we've really come across is the need for a lot more information and ready numbers and figures and status facts on where the Caribbean is on blue economy. So we continue to grow in that area. I know that the next speaker will speak a lot more about the conventions and the role that we play in those conventions and the limitations that we have in some of how we can play a part in that sector. And we hope that what the CBF is doing is creating opportunities for considering both the international sector and what's required, as well as what's needed on the ground through some of the work that we've been doing through our programs. And that's all that I had in terms of a presentation, because I think the discussion with the group is going to be a lot more fruitful, and therefore I will pause here and thank you all again for your attention.
So I'd like to, for our next speaker, I would like to welcome Yuvan Bijahu. Apologies for my mispronunciation there, if there is any. He is Senior Advisor to the Director General of the World Trade Organization. His portfolio includes the areas of trade and environment and climate change, market access, Africa, fisheries, UN systems, and the international financial institutions. He's also a visiting professor of Blue Diplomacy at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. And previously, he worked at the World Bank as a team leader and the Natural Resources Management Specialist area of the Blue and Green Economy, with a focus on climate change and ocean economy, agriculture, environmental services, and trade competitiveness. He was instrumental in helping develop the climate investment funds, the Blue Economy Development Framework, and a number of economic sector works, and building the African Climate Business Plan. In 2014, he was Senior Advisor to the President of Ghana, and between 2008 and 2013, he represented the World Bank at the United Nations in New York. So as you can tell, our next speaker comes with a huge amount of experience and expertise in this area. So we'd like to welcome you here today and thank you for joining us. And I'll pass the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilkinson. I hope you can hear me okay. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure, delight to be with you. Unfortunately, I can't be with you in person, as much as I would have loved to be at the Shudat Ramphal Center. So let me first of all thank Dr. Jean-Yves Remy, Dr. Wilkinson for putting this really impressive program together on trade and the blue economy. And I'll also like to thank my very good friend and colleague, Stephen Fevrier, Ambassador Stephen Fevrier, who's also a senior advisor to the DG at the WTO, who's been ably helping to put this program together. I hope it will be useful for your perusal and for your learning. First of all, I'd like to really say that I don't have any PowerPoint presentation for you. On the other hand, I do have a replica of Monet's Saint André painting, which is right behind me, if you can see it. It's one of my favorite paintings because I think it really tells the story of where things are moving in a way. This painting was produced in the 1860s. It was rejected many times. It didn't make it in the exhibitions. So Monet, used it, hid it, stored it, and eventually it ended up now where it is. There's two copies of it. I don't own one of them. I own the replica. But it's a story which really shows where the fishermen of that time, where the regattas coming back from the seas with the fish. And if you look a little bit back at the background, I'm not 100% sure if you can see it, but you can see the urbanization sprawling around the beach coastal areas. It's a very telling story because myself, I come from Mauritius, another small island, very much to similar colleagues from either St. Kitts and Nevis or Grenada or Dominica or elsewhere in the region. I think we will identify very closely to this painting. Oftentimes, it's been the bread and butter of some of our core sectors. No PowerPoint from me today, but really just to illustrate a little bit where some sectors are headed, what opportunities lie ahead, and what are some of the risks and challenges we face as small island developing states. I'd like to give my presentation a bit of a sense of direction, in the sense that I'll give you some perspectives from somebody who has worked in international financial institutions, namely the World Bank, and closely with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as well as somebody who deeply cares about the oceans agenda. And importantly, somebody who comes from Mauritius and faces the similar opportunities and challenges that many of you face in your region. I'm looking forward to hearing from you on some of those challenges and opportunities, and see whether we could elaborate more on that and unpack the challenges. First of all, in terms of where global trade is right now, and maybe I'll kick off with that. I think we are all operating under a very difficult international political context and economic context. There's no need for me to mention so many of these issues, but just to name a few, the ongoing war, I should say wars in some parts of the world, but especially also now in Europe on Ukraine itself, as well as Russia, two major food producing countries, as well as exporters of fertilizers, minerals, different types of wheats, etc. Oftentimes very important for net food importing countries, from Botswana to Egypt to St. Kitts and Nevis, you name it. A number of countries around the world import food from Ukraine and Russia as well. These are difficult times for small island developing states, who are oftentimes importing those kind of products and foods. The war has also is coming at a time when there's a slow recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that, of course, the Caribbean also was one of the regions that tried to do its best in terms of protecting its population, but no region has been really spared from the impacts of the COVID-19. And of course, in terms of access, we also know that some regions like Africa, some of the Caribbean countries have found themselves in very difficult situations in terms of accessing vaccines. So these kind of political contexts, developments in international political economy, in terms of international cooperation, have made it very difficult for countries to come out of the crisis successfely, right? I don't think there's any country that I can think of that has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic really successfully. Pretty much, trade was down, healthcare systems were down, imports and exports were troubled. I mean, you name it. And when you find countries that are small island developing states like my own, Mauritius, highly dependent on tourism, your own countries, where, in 2020, for example, you were depending for around $57 billion of your economies, around 15 plus, a little bit more than 15% of the GDP around in the region were really dependent, in the Caribbean, were really dependent on tourism. You obviously took a huge hit. And some of those impacts are obviously very much being felt. So when we look at these slow recovery, the war, the food crisis, right, a mega food crisis in the making, which could last for years, and all the geopolitical context, it obviously makes it very difficult for policymakers to think, how are we going to leverage the attention, political attention, the political commitment, and the required policy considerations needed to address the blue economy, right? It makes it very, very difficult for policymakers to do that. And from the Caribbean region, I'm sure you're feeling that perhaps more than many other parts of the world. Of course, Africa also is one of them, but the Caribbean also is definitely one region which has been hit quite badly. Compounded to that, I think, is the issue that we have in terms when we look at the global trade agenda, is the fact that climate change is impacting trade massively, right? It's impacting shipping routes, it's impacting trade routes, it's impacting what we trade. Today, you may be trading a lot in terms of fisheries, but tomorrow that may and will probably very much likely change. One of our key WTO World Trade Organization's World Trade Report this year, which will be launched at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, will be focusing precisely on this sort of interrelationship between trade and climate change and the nexus, and how climate is going to be impacting trade very negatively in the future, but that trade can also be used as a force for good for climate. There's a number of opportunities to look ahead. So this is just to set the context a little bit in terms of where we are generally as the international community, and where are SIDS position within these discussions. So it's one of great challenge, of great problematic challenge in terms of the international context. And we're not out of the woods yet, right? We're not out of the forest. I mean, the pandemic is ongoing in many parts of the world. You know, we listened to the WHO recently at our WTO Public Forum. We're not entirely out of the woods, right? So it's something to keep in mind. And access to vaccines has not always been easy, and it's not necessarily easy for every person in the world. So that's one thing to think of. Second is the tourism challenges that I mentioned, and of course the climatic issues and the war that I just mentioned. But when we look at that, and when I think, okay, for the last 40 years of global trade, where, you know, people have been lifted out of poverty, more than billions of people have been lifted out of global poverty, and prosperity has risen around the world. You look at the World Bank data through their global economic prospects every year. There's quite a lot of good research done in terms of how many people are out of poverty. But trade has been built on very much brown sectors, on polluting sectors, on sectors that have been trading goods and services done on land. And they haven't been necessarily good for the planet. And I think as much as the different poverty and environment objectives should have been together, we know from the 80s that they were very much split. It took 20 years in an institution like the World Bank Group to put environment, agriculture, development together as an ocean agriculture scape perspective, because you want to look at both your land and your oceans, right? You want to look at it horizontally. There is no green economy if you don't tackle the blue part, the blue economy issues. So I think there's been quite a lot of good things that took place over the years. When we look at that, also, we've had the evolution of the SDGs, which was thanks a lot to the leadership of small island developing states. And I'd like to recognize also the immense work that Ambassador Angus Friday, who's now heading the blue economy work in the Waite Institute, but who's a former ambassador of Grenada to the United Nations and to the US, who's been an excellent mentor to me, a great colleague, and a global leader on the blue economy. And he's from your region. And there are many, obviously, unsung heroes who are harnessing the power of the oceans and the seas in many different ways. But I'd like to of course, remember my very good friend Angus Friday, who's been instrumental in these topics and helping make the SDG 14 happen. And it was the small island states. It was the small island developing states. And we know how tough it was to get an SDG on the oceans, to get indicators on the ocean agenda, to be able to make the ocean conference the first UN conference on the oceans. And yet it's the least funded SDG, right? SDG 14 on the sustainable development of our oceans, sustainable fisheries for development, and the sustainable use of our resources is the least funded SDG. So it begs the question: how do we change that? And I'm really glad to hear Karen McDonald, Gail, speak so well about some of those financial institutions, new initiatives that are out there to really leverage, unlock the financing part, right? Seychelles did a lot of great work on the blue economy financing, whether it be for some of the debt for nature swap, whether it be the blue bonds, and it's been replicated a little bit around the world with a number of other private sector companies and others. So I think that these are really kudos to the small island developing states. But again, as much as there has been excitement about the oceans, there's been a movement around it. The reality is not a great one, right? Look around. Our fisheries sectors, and I'll get into those challenges in a minute. But just to get back on that point, that over the last 40 years, development has been a bit erratic, has been a bit unpredictable in many ways, despite the rules, despite global rules that regulate trade, that make trade a bit more efficient, more transparent, that tries to create a more equitable playing field. In many ways, small islands have not been able to really grasp the opportunities of new sectors, the global value chains, making sure that, you know, the lady who's fishing the fish from the ocean and bringing it back to land, that particular product can be tapped into a much higher global value chain product and service for mega export to the world. It hasn't always been the case in many small island developing states. The rules have been tough. The rules have been either non-inclusive, locally or internationally, and there's good merits now to look at the future of trade a bit differently, to make it more inclusive, to bring small and medium enterprises. Because again, look around, the trade finance challenges, a lot of SMEs find it very difficult to get access to finance, to get letters of credit. And with the pandemic, it's been only harder. So there is a need for international policymakers to rethink. The future of trade needs to embed women, needs to embed small-scale communities, needs to embed people who are harnessing and protecting our natural resources. And oftentimes it's the people who live on the oceans, the fishermen around the world. And yet, when we walk into the ministries of fisheries in many parts of the world, it remains one of the poorest ministries. Why is that? It remains one of the most neglected sectors. Why is that? It's not the blue economy ministry that one would think is dynamic, it's new, it's got the financing around it, it's got the muscles, but it's not the case. So we have to ask ourselves those questions, policymakers, and that is not just ministries of environment or ministries of fisheries or agriculture, but really ministries of planning, prime minister's office, ministries of finance, those that are really oftentimes calling the shots on policy making, need to really sit down with their ministries of fisheries to really see how to invest in the sector. Because again, millions of people, billions of people, as a matter of fact, depend on fisheries as a staple food. They depend on nutrition for food. Even in the early days of a fetus and a child, having, you know, elements of good fisheries nutrition, omega-3 and others, could be very, very, very instrumental for their proper development. And yet, the other story is also true, which is basically we are finding microbeads in the stomach of fetuses and new babies and seabirds and etc. So which begs the question, on one hand, we have fisheries sector very poor, more investment needed, and on the other hand, a surge of the production and consumption of products which are sometimes wrong for the environment and for the planet. In that case, plastics, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm just tossing out here some questions to really get people to think, because many of you, I'm sure, already are in positions of policy making, and some of you may end up in even higher positions. And we have to ask ourselves these questions, is how do you invest in the fisheries sector? In my own country, Mauritius, a personal story is that, yes, there have been some policymakers who decided we should not have the fisheries sector become more prominent because it was traditionally run by poor fishermen. So Mauritius wants to become a richer, higher income country. Therefore, we will go towards hydrocarbons. We will go explore what's under our ocean. But then it begs the question, is that the right policy decision? Is that what you call the blue economy? We all know the fisheries sector is an entry point to the blue economy. And if you can't manage your fisheries, it will be even harder to manage other sectors. So these are the type of questions that I was faced with as a World Bank official, navigating through the different ministries back home. And you may also be facing some similar questions when you try to develop a new sector where there's a lot of excitement, a lot of hype, a lot of expectations. And what we did at the bank was we quantified the ocean economy to demonstrate that an investment of around $580 million per year would help in doubling the current share of the ocean economy, which was at that time in 2017, around 12.5% of the GDP of Mauritius to transform it to around 25% of its GDP. And that would have taken, through a CGE, computer-generated equilibrium model, would have taken between 15 and 17 years. And obviously, and I think Dr. Karen MacDonald mentioned that very well, is that, that kind of money, that kind of financing that's going to be needed is quite massive, right? So you're going to have to look for new sources of finance. And I think the trouble with the international aid architecture and the international climate financing architecture and the international architecture, full stop, is that SIDS often are at a disadvantage. They are often at a disadvantage of global trade, of exports, of having to import, obviously, because they're far from production. They're not mechanized, they're not industrialized. They don't have the technology required at scale and at speed. We don't necessarily have the skills either. We have brain drain. Every young Mauritian that I speak to, again, from my own country, I can only talk from my own country. But of course, a lot of people chat and talk as well. People are looking for a better future outside. That's not a new story. That's been happening since time immemorial. But I think with the pandemic, with slow growth, slow recovery, lack of opportunities, and a continuation of some systems, either economic, political, people do feel trapped, right? And people want to leave, and the youngsters want to leave. And that's one of the biggest challenges for SIDS, in my view, is that the type of skills that are going to be needed to build a blue economy will have to be built externally and internally, but it has to come back to the SIDS. And I don't always see that happening, to be honest with you, because there is a brain drain. There's an attraction for foreign jobs, for higher income, for supporting your family. And the opportunities are limited back home. Despite being small economies, one would have thought that maybe it's easier to get a job, but it's not in practice, precisely because of different reasons: political fiefdoms, structures, power play, politics, you name it, lack of meritocracy, lack of opportunities. There's so many reasons one can talk about in many parts of the world, not just SIDS. It makes it very difficult for the very competent person who studied abroad, who went back home, who wants to work on the blue economy, but has no job in the blue economy sector. So we have to be very realistic to say that, okay, if we're going to build a blue economy for Grenada, for St. Lucia, for Guyana, for, you name it, I can't name all the countries, we're going to have to provide the jobs of tomorrow. We're going to have to become the blue laboratories, the blue labs, for exporting high-end, high-quality service and high-quality goods with high value, made in Dominica, made in Grenada. I would say probably even better, made by Grenada, right? By. Let's try to see the nuance of by versus made in, right? So you made by, which connotes higher value, higher sort of potential value in global value chains. So I think it would be really great to see how this comes about in the future. That's going to be one major policy question. And what I've seen, having worked at the World Bank as a natural resources specialist economist, is that small island developing states also have an issue with labor mobility. The labor laws can be very strict. Who can get to work in small islands? Who can work there, right? But you want to be able to attract the best. You want to become an island or a group of islands working together to share this pool of expertise and experience. And I think that's going to be important as well. And that's why I think it's so great that Jean-Yves Remy is putting this course together for many people in the region. That's fantastic, because for me, there is no blue economy if islands are going to work on their own. It's just not going to happen. There's no point, one island doing a blue economy center, but for that island, and then somebody else doing something completely different, which doesn't really match the agenda. So islanders will need to work very closely together, in my view, so that trade can be enhanced, so that the trade costs can be reduced, And not everybody needs to go off to the goalpost, right? You could have a striker, because I love football, and I'm sure you do as well, because somebody can be the goalkeeper, somebody can be the midfielder, the striker, but it's a teamwork. And I think that's where islands can really make the difference here. Because let's be honest, as I said, the international architecture is very challenging to access finance. We know how difficult it is to get money from the Green Climate Fund, to tap in the blue resources from that for many small islands. It's sometimes very political. Second, climate financing. You know where things are. There are very challenging debates right now as we speak, leading to COP27. Challenges related to which you know better than anybody, right? The cyclones that are hitting the region, the typhoons, the hurricanes. In my part of the world, we call it cyclones. So Ian right now is moving. So that has huge impacts on the US, and probably the US impacts on the Caribbean. And you've seen, I mean, Grenada's economy. Angus told me so many times how much from one day to another, the debt to GDP skyrocketed more than 200%. So this is going to become a recurrence of the future. It's the new normal. The work that I did at the bank, I saw that 7% of Mauritius's GDP will be lost over the next 40 years only because of cyclones. And that was a conservative figure, right? Let me just repeat it. 7% of our GDP will disappear just because of cyclones in Mauritius. That's not to take into consideration storm surges, beach erosion, coral reefs dying, or species moving from one place to another. That's just cyclones. So what does that mean? That means that you're going to have to look at much more on green ports infrastructure, resilient ports, investing in natural capital, investing in people to take care of those natural capital. You're going to have to put value on your oceans and your natural resources. You probably wouldn't be able to do tourism the way you're doing it now. You're going to have to put prices and value on those natural assets, which are becoming stranded assets, right? The UK came up with some work some years ago that I was also involved in supporting from the World Bank side on natural capital accounts, right? You've got buildings that are going to just become stranded assets over the next 5 years just because of climate. They become a risk. They become dangerous, right? And that's the same for your corals, for your reefs, for your erosions, patterns, etc., agricultural runoffs, you name it. Everything will become a stranded asset in many parts of the world. So that means that you need the best scientists to advise you, to look into those challenges. Let me perhaps quickly, if that's okay, talk about one last point, which is basically the opportunities ahead. I think that the opportunities are there, though, and I think we haven't stopped trying. I think islanders, our history says it all. Our great-grandparents come from many parts of the world in very difficult conditions, Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, Europe, different reasons also, but at least in the case of Mauritius, we have very similar history, and that's why I'm always very happy to meet my fellow brothers and sisters from the region, is because we share a common history, and we've come from very difficult backgrounds, and we've made the country where we are now. And you can see our leaders, our book writers, our students, our athletes, chefs, cuisines, dancers, you name it. We're doing very well internationally. On many occasions, internationally, we're doing very well. And also back home, for those who have stayed, chapeau to them. They're keeping the train running back home, and that's fantastic. Our families are there. But we do care about seeing our countries move forward, right? We do care about the opportunities and harnessing that. And that's why I'm very positive, because I think when we look around trade, youngsters, the younger generation, are really looking for change, right? They're looking for greener products. They're looking for more sustainable patterns of consumption. And I'm not saying that they always are right? I mean, I look at my 17-month-old son, he's not always right, I can tell you that. But I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt that they there is a trend, there is there is a generational change where people are asking for results. They're asking for greening trade. They're asking for deplastifying the economy. They're looking for new ways of doing things, which are more peer-to-peer and much more in support of the global common goods, like the oceans, clean air, healthy food, perhaps. And we need to encourage that, because the oceans is everybody's business. It's not just Stevens, Janice, Andrea, or myself, or yours. No, it's everybody. It's your prime minister, to your minister of finance, to your minister of environment, to your minister of trade. I mean, when I look at the WTO, for example, you know, there's a lot of opportunities for us to help members push this agenda further. Because again, if we talk about a $24 trillion economy, the seventh largest economy, discounting oil, etc., this is a huge portion of global trade, and we need to harness that through more sustainable shipping, through more sustainable products, through, as you know, Karen also mentioned, carbon pricing, right? So that we can avoid trade frictions of the future, but also capture carbon storage, which goes to the sink of our oceans, and we need to be able to harness that and leverage financially these options. And there has been some initiatives that's been started, as you know very well. But I do see opportunities for us to work with the new generation of leaders and government officials, the private sector, to really leverage support and coordination, collaboration, to promote much better goods and services coming from small island developing states to larger economies. I think that's definitely something that we would be very keen to work very much closer with you. At the WTO, there are, of course, a number of structured discussions. There are initiatives on plastics, for example. You know, we have around 72 members who are members of the sponsors of the Plastics Initiative. It's an informal dialogue on plastics. And these are representing 75% of annual trade in plastics. These are representing, country members who are responsible for 75% of annual trade in plastics. So these are really not only the large economies, but also smaller ones. And obviously, down the road, who would not want to see a treaty on plastics, not only at the UN down the road, but also at the WTO? But that's, of course, for members to agree on. But these are the types of questions which we would like to see, because obviously plastics is another huge problem. When I look at the Dominican Republic, just to name a few, of course, this is not to name and shame, but I think every country really suffers from plastics. The waste of plastics, the way it's trashed, or the way that it fills in our rivers, is that it really challenges us, right? To think, how do we deplastify the economy? How do we look at the hidden costs of plastic, right? We're talking about a $1 trillion economy. How do you leverage that? How do you, when a car is exported, at least 50% of it is plastic. But that's not accounted, right, in global trade the same way some products are really codified, so we know what's traded and how much is traded. So that's really a hidden flow of plastic that needs to be properly accounted for and quantified. And the same for other products, right? Not just cars. So let me finish by saying that I'm personally very positive about the fact that SIGDs will make it, and that they will be able to continue their ascent into the global economy. We will need not just SIDS to work on this, but of course the solidarity, the support of industrialized nations, as well as international financial institutions. Probably, I would also say, from a personal point of view, is that maybe the governance of some institutions also need to be relooked at, so that it's more reflective of the international system, of the international community, which needs to be much more inclusive. And we're starting to see some trends on that. Not everywhere, but I think that's the direction that we would like to see. And you can really count on the WTO if there are some areas that you would like to see more. Of course, you have your own delegates in Geneva, but the Secretariat will be happy to at least listen in the same way we do with Janive's courses, the WTO co-chairs program, etc., to work with you to sort of see how we can reflect those questions better in discussions, in literature reviews, in analytical work, in perhaps through your memberships at the WTO, the structured discussions, the environmental committees, etc. So I'll finish on this and say that I look forward to a really good discussion on those topics moving forward. Thank you.
I think what we're going to do now, in the interest of time, if it's okay, is we will move straight on to our next speaker. So thank you, Yuval and Karen. That was a great start to our session today. Really interesting, really informative. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Maureen Headley, who works for the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism Secretariat, which is an intergovernmental organisation consisting of 17 member states. Its mission is to promote and facilitate the responsible utilisation of the region's fisheries and other aquatic resources for the economic and social benefits of the current and future population of the region. She is currently the Programme Manager for the Fisheries Management Development and has worked in the sector for over a decade. Karen provides technical and advisory support to member states for the implementation of activities in a number of areas. Some of these include development and implementation of the fisheries management plans and conservation and management measures for key fisheries and ecosystems to ensure the sustainable use of the resources and protection of critical habitats and ecosystems, and also the application of sustainable management practices evidenced by the use of best available scientific information and advice, traditional knowledge, and the application of precautionary and ecosystem approaches. And finally, the enhancement of the fisheries sector role and contribution within the blue economy by strengthening the competitive advantage and profitability of fisheries and aquaculture. So Karen, Maureen, welcome. You're going to be covering the management of the Caribbean regional fisheries today. We really look forward to hearing your comments, your presentation, and we will have questions afterwards, but I'll give you the floor now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and good day to everyone. If you could just confirm that you are seeing my screen. So I will be presenting on managing the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. Okay, so the establishment and purpose of the CRFM. CRFM was established through the regional intergovernmental agreement, which was signed in 2002. And the organization adopted its own rules of procedures in 2002 and was officially inaugurated on the 27th of March 2003 in Belize. Our purpose is to promote the development, conservation, and the management of the shared living aquatic resources of the region in a responsible and sustainable manner, and also to improve the quality of life of the people who depend on fishery resources for their well-being and livelihoods. The organization has an independent international legal personality, and we can enter into contracts and be party to legal proceedings. We have 17 member states, and we also have other states and agencies which have observer status. Now, we consist of 3 bodies: the Secretariat, which is composed of scientific and technical staff, and then there's the Forum, which is made up of the chief fisheries officers within the 17 member states. We also have public and private sector, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs that participate in the Forum. And then the Ministerial Council, and this is made up of the ministers from the 17 member states who have fisheries as part of their portfolio. And we also report to COTED, the Council for Trade and Economic Development, and COFCOR, which is a Council for Foreign and Community Relations. And this is within the CARICOM framework. Sorry. We have the Caribbean Community Common Fisheries Policy, which guides our work. And this represents the agreed vision, goal, and objectives of the community. That is a Caribbean community and its members in relation to conservation, management, and sustainable utilization of fisheries resources in the Caribbean. And the policy is also expected to guide the community in its decision-making, and subsequent legal agreements, decisions, or measures at both the regional and national levels may be evaluated against the Common Fisheries Policy. This policy was adopted by the 41st special meeting of COTED as the final policy document of the Caribbean community. And that happened in 2014. And then 3 years later, the 71st special meeting of COTED designated the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism as the competent agency for the policy. And then
Dr. Marin, I'm
yes?
really sorry to disturb you. But I think some of the participants are hearing a lot of the static from your mic. So I'm just wondering if you can move it a little further away.
Okay, is that better?
Is
that better now?
I think so.
Yes?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. And then the 75th special meeting of COTED accepted in 2018, accepted 2 protocols to the policy, and these protocols cover securing sustainable small-scale fisheries for Caribbean community fisher folk and societies. And the second protocol covers climate change adaptation and disaster risk management in fisheries and aquaculture. So as the competent agency for the Common Fisheries Policy, CRFM has responsibilities directly linked to Article 60 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which covers fisheries management and development. And some of the roles include enhancing the institutional capabilities in policy formulation, registration and management systems, resource monitoring and assessment, and harvesting and post-harvesting technologies. Another one is establishing mechanisms to provide assistance in developing, managing, and conservation of fisheries resources, and also discharging of obligations relating to fisheries resources arising under UNCLOS, the relevant articles. Another role is establishing development programs for aquaculture, encouraging the establishment of protected aquatic habitats and associated terrestrial areas and fish populations for the sustainable development of fisheries resources, and also establishing, facilitating and strengthening human and research resources at the professional, technical, and vocational levels. And just to highlight the vision of the Common Fisheries Policy is effective cooperation and collaboration among participating parties in conservation, management, and sustainable utilization of fisheries resources and related ecosystems in order to secure maximum benefits for the Caribbean people and region. And the goal is to establish, within the context of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, appropriate measures for, again, conservation, management, and sustainable utilization and development of fisheries resources and ecosystems, building capacity among fishers, and optimizing the social and economic returns from fisheries, and also promoting competitive trade and stable market conditions. We also have our third strategic plan, which was approved last year and will go until 2030. And we have 4 strategic areas: environmental resilience, economic resilience, social resilience, and climate resilience. And these fall under 4 strategic, and we have 4 strategic goals, including, so strategic goal 1 is the sustainable use and management of fisheries and aquaculture resources in the Caribbean. Strategic goal 2 is improvement of the welfare and sustainable livelihoods of fishing and aquaculture communities. Strategic goal 3 is to contribute to the provision of sufficient, safe, and nutritious seafood that meets the dietary requirements of the member states' populations. And strategic goal 4 is to promote the development of a regional fishery sector that is resilient to climate change, natural disasters, external shocks, and enhanced through comprehensive disaster risk management and recovery arrangements. And of course, we're operating within the policy and legislative framework, which I shared earlier, and we're using evidence-based policy to make decisions and inform interventions. And just to highlight some of the opportunities for creating blue economy linkages under some of the strategic objectives that are part of our strategic plan, we have strategic objectives covering effective sustainable management and utilization of fisheries resources in member states, promotion of economic models for varying scales and types of aquaculture operations to improve food production and livelihoods. Another objective is strengthened monitoring, control, and surveillance systems and frameworks to combat illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing and organized crime in the fishery sector. Another objective is also competitive and profitable fisheries and marine resources development within the blue economic space of member states. Another objective is capacity building and institutional strengthening across all sectors to promote sustainable resource use. Another objective is promotion of market development and safe consumption along fisheries value chains. Another of our objectives is the promotion of improved access and consumption of nutritious fish and seafood. And another one is enhanced and regional and national frameworks, mechanisms, and enabling environments to monitor climate change and ocean acidification impacts to fisheries and marine ecosystems. So a lot of our work would be related to the blue economy, would be guided by these objectives. In addition to working very closely to address and achieve targets under SDG 14, our work also contributes to SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 10, reduce inequalities, SDG 13, climate action, and of course, SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. So now about a little bit more about the fisheries and aquaculture sector in the member states. All the independent CRFM member states are small island development states, and the fisheries resources occur in inland waters and or freshwater systems, including rivers, ponds, and lakes. We also have aquaculture systems, and then the marine waters, including the territorial sea, the archipelagic waters, the exclusive economic zone, and the high seas. Fish harvesting activities occur in the recreational fisheries, sports fisheries, subsistence fisheries, and commercial capture fisheries, and aquaculture. And sustainable expansion and intensification of fish production through responsible aquaculture development is also considered to be a priority. Now, a little bit of statistics. The marine capture fisheries production for the CRFM member states in 2020. In terms of meat weight, the countries produced 267,000 tons. And that was at a value of $435 million US. And that's from the marine capture fisheries sector. For the aquaculture sector in 2020, the production was about 7,800 tons at a value of $41 million US. In terms of employment in the direct production in the marine capture fisheries was estimated at about 113,000 persons, and in the aquaculture sector, 4,796 persons. Regarding trade, for total domestic exports, including exports for fish, for food, bait, and live ornamental fish for breeding in 2020, the total meat weight was 55,472 tons at a value of $234 million US. And the top three markets were USA. No, the top four markets were USA, Canada, France, and Jamaica. We are net importers of fish products. So for that same year, we imported about 100,000 tons of fish product valued at $332 million US. So in terms of developing the blue economy going forward, CRFM recognizes the potential of the blue economy, and in particular, small scale fisheries and aquaculture to food security, jobs, livelihood, trade, reducing the food import bill, especially for CARICOM, especially under the 25 by 25 CARICOM initiative, which is looking to reduce the food import bill by 25%. And fisheries and aquaculture will have an important role to play in this reduction. And also going forward, the blue economy will contribute to sustainable social and economic growth and development. What is required for developing the blue economy going forward? Well, we recognize that we will need regional and national policy frameworks and capacities to secure additional tangible sustainable benefits from the marine resources. We will need evidence-based decision-making, marine spatial planning and protected areas, value addition, aquaculture, and prevention and deterrence of IUU fishing and organized crime, which threatens the fishery sector. Now, we have at the highest level, the CRFM Ministerial Council has made resolutions regarding the blue economy, and under the themes that I would have described earlier. So in terms of evidence-based decision-making, we do have a resolution on the CARIS project, and this is a project between CARICOM and Iceland, and it is developing cloud-based data. It is a cloud-based data management tool, and it is to be used by data collectors to collect, store, and report on fisheries data for sustainable management of the living marine resources, because for management to occur, we do need to have data. There's also a resolution on the request to FAO for a research vessel to conduct an independent marine survey, and this will be important for determining what resources we have and also to inform the value of the marine ecosystems, including the fisheries resources. In terms of marine spatial planning and marine management areas and value addition, there we do have resolutions on a Caribbean Blue Economy project, and it is aimed at promoting national blue economy priorities through marine spatial planning in the Caribbean large marine ecosystem. And this will be using climate and gender sensitive approaches. In terms of aquaculture, we have a resolution on aquaculture development in the Caribbean in member states. And then we also have, in terms of prevention and deterrence of IUU fishing, we have a resolution on IUU fishing and organized crime in the fishing industry. And we also have the Copenhagen Declaration on transnational organized crime in the global fishing industry. And so far we have 12 member states that are signatory to that declaration. So that is the end of my presentation. In terms of material, I have the references here, and these can be accessed at our website, which is on the next slide.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very
Henry.
much. Yes.
That's really interesting and informative. Are you happy for us to share your presentation with the participants?
Yes, sure.
Fantastic. I don't know. Brilliant. I'll just stop sharing.
Okay.
We're going to collect questions at the end from both of the talks, if that's okay. So if you're able to join us for the remaining talk, that would be fantastic. So I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome our final speaker of today. We're honoured to have Professor David Berry with us. He served 2 consecutive terms as Dean of Law at Cave Hill campus. The 2 terms as University Dean of Law. He teaches in areas of public international law and regional integration law, and has written articles and book chapters in the same fields. One of his books is detailing Caribbean integration law and the transitions in the Caribbean lawmaking, and the confluence of national and international law. Professor Berry practices in various areas of international law, primarily serving governments and regional and international organisations. He's served as counsel or deputy agent in cases before a number of tribunals, including the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, the Barbados-Trinidad Maritime Boundary, and the Caribbean Court of Justice. So welcome, Professor Berry. We're thrilled to have you here today. We can't wait to hear your presentation that's going to cover the international regimes that govern the blue economy, and I believe you're going to be looking at Antigua and Barbuda. So thank you very much, and the floor's yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea and Janives and others for inviting me to be here today. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. Can the person see it?
Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I've been asked to speak about international regimes that govern the blue economy, and I will be looking at international regimes, but also applying it to a kind of case study. So I'll be looking at Antigua and Barbuda as well. And what I want to do today is sketch the contours of the various law of the sea regimes governing the topic, and flesh this out by thinking about how these regimes interact with national regimes, national legal regimes. So as you would have already learned in previous lectures, a blue economy requires an understanding of the interlinkages between human activities on both the land and in the marine ecosystems in the context of supporting environmental sustainability. And these interlinkages are critical. If you focus only on a few specified sectors without considering the impacts upon other areas, you may not end up producing a blue economy at all, and certainly one that's not sustainable or suitable to the needs of the country concerned. So blue economies, by their essence, so I'm stepping back and talking about what is required for a blue economy. Blue economies, in their essence, require you to balance growth and sustainability in order to ensure optimal use of ocean resources to the maximum benefit, or at least minimal harm to the environment. I would also add that blue economies require anchoring in the Law of the Sea Convention that we've already heard mentioned by Marin. And you can do a variety of activities, and in my talk, I will discuss some of the activities that fall under blue economy, not just fisheries and aquaculture, but a whole range of activities. And I would suggest that to effectively implement a blue economy in any Caribbean member state, a number of measures would be required. In particular, you need, as I've mentioned already, effective implementation of UNCLOS, but also it's implementing agreements, other treaties, oceans, and environment-related treaties and agreements. Then you also need to adopt an ecosystem-based management framework for your country. And that could include a variety of things. All right, so let me move to that was just the introduction. So these are things I'm going to talk about during my talk. So first is ocean treaty regimes. I'll introduce you to those. Maritime zones, for those of you that haven't done the Law of the Sea Convention in the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea in detail, I'll introduce you to the different zones because it has a zonal scope and distribution of competences as it states. And then I'll introduce you to regional and international organizations that might be relevant to a blue economy. The BBNJ agreement, which is another developing area that might relate to the blue economy. BBNJ stands for Marine Biological Diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And then I'll look at Antigua and Barbuda's blue economy as an example of a state that is attempting to implement a fulsome blue economy structure. All right, so these are the main ocean treaty instruments. And the first one, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, as we call it in shorthand, or as we should in the Caribbean call it, the Montego Bay Convention, is really the constitution of the oceans. It is the most fundamental treaty, and it has laws and rules governing almost every activity in the oceans. However, UNCLOS was adopted, as you can see, in 1982, and some things have changed and evolved, and as a result, we have implementing agreements that expand upon and further enforce UNCLOS provisions. So the first one is the 1994 agreement relating to the implementation of Part 11 of UNCLOS. I know that's an exciting title, but what that does is it deals with the deep seabed area and clarifies the regime governing the deep seabed. Then we have the 1995 agreement for implementation of the provisions of UNCLOS related to the conservation and management straddling fish stocks and highly migratory species. Migratory fish stocks, this is called the Fish Stocks Agreement, and this obviously deals with a particular type of fish species that have to be regulated or conserved in a certain way. And then we have an agreement that we are currently working on, and I have been involved as CARICOM negotiating on the CARICOM negotiating team on this at the United Nations. And this is the agreement on the UN. It's an implementing agreement under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, or the BBNJ agreement. Now, UNCLOS, as I've indicated, sets out the broad framework for ocean governance, and it allocates different levels of jurisdiction or competence on ocean matters to states and gives rights and freedoms to ships, but it bases this on maritime zones and marine resources within those zones and marine related activities. Now, with regard to maritime zones within its national jurisdiction, the coastal state enjoys, and this is the way that I tell my students to think about it, enjoys the more extensive rights closer to the shore. So closer you are to the coastal state, the more rights the coastal state has. And the further away you are from the coastal state shores, the less rights the coastal state is likely to have. All right, this is a chart which I have adopted from Margot Bohan, which is a brilliant illustration of the different areas of the oceans and the regimes under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea that govern it. So if you look, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this is the baseline. The baseline is the low water mark. So when the tide goes out, where the water touches the sand, that is the low water mark at sort of normal low tides. Everything on the landward side of the baseline is called internal waters. So that little bit of water at high tide, plus lakes, rivers, etc., those are internal waters. And then from the baseline, you draw out all these other zones. They're measured from the baseline. So territorial sea, you can claim one up to 12 nautical miles. And then you can have exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles from the baseline up to that amount. And then you have the continental shelf. And then beyond your continental shelf, or beyond 200 nautical miles, you have the high seas. So those are the different regimes. There's also a zone called the contiguous zone, which is drawn up to 24 nautical miles from the baseline. But really, it exists in this area, 12 to 24 nautical miles. So what do all these things do? Internal waters, so the waters above at high tide and rivers, etc., are subject to full state sovereignty. They are waters on the landward side of the baseline, full sovereignty. We also have a strange regime for archipelagos where you can have kind of archipelagic waters, which are a kind of quasi-internal waters, but with not full absolute sovereignty. It's slightly modified sovereignty. And then you have the territorial sea, over which the coastal state has sovereignty over the water column, seabed, and subsoil. And all of that is subject to sovereignty, but subject to the convention and the rules of international law. And then the contiguous zone, this is really an enforcement zone. So if a ship is going to go in here and do something illegal, you can catch them out here. And it's only deals with certain forms of illegality, customs violations, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary violations. But it's a sort of catching area. Either the activity was done here and you can catch them there, or they're about to do it inside your territorial sea, and you can prevent it. Exclusive economic zone, you have sovereign rights. And the phrasing here is deliberate. It's not sovereignty, sovereign rights for the purposes of exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing your natural resources, living and non-living. And these include rights over both the water column, the fishes and things in the water column, the seabed, and the subsoil. And then the continental shelf is the seabed and subsoil. But as you can see, it can go beyond 200 nautical miles. You automatically get 200 nautical miles of continental shelf if you want it, and you automatically get 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone if you want it. But if your geography permits, if your continental margin, et cetera, permits, you could extend it out to up to maybe 350 nautical miles. The equation is up there. So the continental shelf allows you sovereign rights over natural resources of the seabed and subsoil. Interestingly, it's mostly non-living resources, but you are allowed to, you do have sovereign rights over sedentary species. And sedentary species are species that must move in constant contact with the bottom of the seabed. Then in the high seas, you have the high seas is not subject to the sovereignty of any state. And in the high seas, all states and vessels of all states have certain freedoms to the high seas, including navigation, overflight, planes can go over, laying submarine cables and pipelines, constructing artificial islands and installations, fishing, scientific research. All of these are subject to the convention, of course. And then the deep seabed, which you see here on the bottom right, that's governed by both UNCLOS and the 1994 agreement. And this is part of the common heritage of humankind. We all technically have rights over the deep seabed area. And what we have set up is the International Seabed Authority. And that authority is supposed to allow or regulate the harvesting of non-living resources from the seabed and subsoil. All right, so that's I know that's a very quick overview of the different zones of the law of the sea. But if you think about it from a blue economy perspective, all of these areas up to the exclusive economic zone can be quite heavily regulated by coastal states, and therefore you would need to protect your environment, say in the exclusive economic zone, your fisheries, et cetera. And so as part of your blue economy, you would need to manage those resources, protect and utilize those resources. In the high seas, right now it's an area of freedoms, and the deep seabed is really about mineral and geological resources. And that's why the new BBNJ agreement is so exciting, because it looks at marine biological diversity. So it's not supposed to interfere with fishing per se, but it's supposed to allow the international community to regulate marine genetic resources, and it has a number of factors. I'll briefly introduce that in a moment. But that would be an implementing agreement that, in a sense, fills some gaps in the Law of the Sea Convention in that area. All right. So what other treaties do you have? Well, I have spared you. I haven't listed them on the slide. There are so many. It would be mind-numbing for you to go through them all. But there are numerous treaties, and what I've done is sort of divide them up into groups. And all of these groups are related to uses of oceans that would be part of a blue economy. So what are the categories? Maritime zones. Maritime zones or joint governance or boundary agreements, those would tell you what areas of the oceans are subject to your sovereignty or to your control. Maritime criminal jurisdiction, Maren talked about criminal enforcement, illegal, unregulated, unreported fisheries, etc. You need to have policing and security jurisdiction over the oceans, both for economic activities and for environmental and conservation purposes. Protection and preservation of the marine environment. Obviously, that's critical for a blue economy. Blue economy has to be sustainable. And if you are degrading your marine environment, that will be problematic. Shipping, you need to be able to regulate your vessels and any vessels that travel through your maritime spaces, including ports. And so you need shipping laws and shipping regimes, and treaties govern that as well. And then ocean governance institutions. And really, there are a couple that I point to here, but there are a range of ocean governance institutions, but the ones I point to are dispute settlement institutions. And these would allow small island states, which don't have traditionally very large militaries or enormous economies, to resolve their disputes using international law rather than threats or force. So if we look at the treaties, I have 4 pages of treaties. So I'll just sort of highlight some of them rather than go through all of them. So in terms of maritime zones, in the Southern Caribbean, we have a maritime boundary agreement between Barbados and Trinidad that was established by an arbitration, one between Guyana and Suriname, again established by an arbitration. Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela established a maritime boundary, Treaty on Delimitation of Marine and Submarine Areas in 1990, bilateral. And then we have an exclusive economic zone cooperation treaty between Guyana and Barbados. There's a little triangle of sea way out at the edge of the exclusive economic zones of the 2 states where it overlaps, and they have a joint cooperation agreement. Maritime criminal jurisdiction, the one we're probably the most familiar with is the shipwrighter agreements, where U.S. ships can exercise enforcement powers in the Caribbean as long as a national of the state in whose waters the ship is sailing is on board, a military officer of that state. Obviously, these agreements are controversial, but we also have other things for maritime criminal jurisdiction, such as the International Convention related to the arrest of seagoing ships. So you have a UN convention on that. Fisheries management, there are many treaties covering this. Maren has already talked about some of them. So the Caribbean Community Common Fisheries Policy, the CRFM, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. But you also have a number of UN treaties, such as the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO. They have agreement on port state measures to prevent, deter, eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. They have compliance and conservation treaties, fisheries. There is a common fisheries surveillance zone that was established by the OECS, etc. And then by far the largest number of treaties, which of course are very important for the blue economy, are those regarding protection and preservation of the marine environment. So you have the Convention on Biological Diversity, various protocols to that. You have within our region, the Convention for the Protection and Development of the Marine Environment of the wider Caribbean region. You have conventions dealing with migratory species, international trade in endangered species and wild fauna and flora, convention governing or preventing marine pollution by dumping, convention on the protection of underwater cultural heritage. I don't know how many of us have thought about that, but underwater wrecks can be great tourist attractions and could be part of your blue economy. There are, of course, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There are conventions on removal of wrecks, etc. Rotterdam Convention on Prior Informed Consent, procedures for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade, which could deal with shipping. And then you have a number of treaties governing shipping and ports. The International Labor Organization has a number of treaties about labor standards on ships and in ports. And then the International Maritime Organization has a number of conventions on safety and navigation in the sea. I won't go through all of them, but there's a wide range of them. And some of them also govern pollution and other activities. And the two ocean governance agreements I wanted to highlight are the protocol on the privileges and immunities of the International Seabed Authority. The International Seabed Authority is in Jamaica, but we have to, in the region, more widely ratify the privileges and immunities protocol so that that we are allowing it to properly implement its activities without threat of lawsuits, et cetera. And then there's a very interesting agreement, which was in the media in 2021. I haven't seen a final copy of it, which is an agreement between Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu. And it's called the Agreement for the Establishment of the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. And this is a dispute resolution agreement that establishes a commission. And the idea is that the commission would take climate change case to ITLOS, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, hoping to clarify responsibility of states for climate change, which is very, very interesting and exciting treaty development. All right, so those were the treaties. Is that all? No, there are a number of non-binding instruments, and these can help shape our activities and help guide us in implementing our obligations under the law of the sea. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Sustainable Development Goals, we've looked at those. That's not binding, but it's goals that we try to achieve. And then there are a variety of things like annual resolutions to the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly makes resolutions on oceans, the law of the sea, sustainable fisheries, and then you have policy guidance and goals and targets set out by the General Assembly. Now, these non-binding instruments also include some adopted by competent regional and international organizations, such as the FAO, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Labor Organization, the International Maritime Organization, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, et cetera. And all of these bodies will make guidelines or set standards that will help us perform activities in accordance with the law of the sea rules and norms. And I've listed some of the FAO ones here on the slide, and they are not binding, but they are used by states and other actors in monitoring the law of the sea. And in our region, of course, we have the Castries Declaration as well. All right, so you have treaties, you have non-binding sources, and then you have international and regional organizations. And I've listed these. There's a large number of them. I just took kind of a sample and listed them that would touch upon ocean governance. And there are many more that I could have listed that are not here. I've listed them with no particular order, but there they are: the International Maritime Organization, the International Whaling Commission, Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission, Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, which we just heard about, the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, ICAT, Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, International Seabed Authority, and then future you should have an international, whether it's an international organization is up for debate, but at least you'll have a conference of the parties. So you'll have a conference of the parties of the Marine Biological Diversity Agreement that is still being drafted. Now, this last international body, the Conference of the Parties and maybe other organs that will make up the BBNJ agreement structure, should be mentioned at least briefly, since it will cover 4 topics directly related to sustainable ocean governance. These are addressed as a package, and the agreement aims to address conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, including marine genetic resources. So the agreement governs marine genetic resources, including sharing of benefits from marine genetic resources, conservation measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments. If you want to do activities in the high seas, you may need an environmental impact assessment, and then capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And you can see the dark blue is all of the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And 60% of the Earth's surface falls under this potential treaties coverage. These are deep areas, includes the deep sea, and they form part of a single interconnected world ocean. And I think this is really important for us to think about, is that something done out in the middle of the Atlantic could have an effect upon the Caribbean, and we need to therefore be able to regulate these things. And marine biological diversity, I mean, we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the deep seabed. And if we are able to find what genetic resources we have out there, you know, what the little ships on shrimps on the hydrothermal vents, how they do what they do, then this could have tremendous benefits for us in all areas of human life, from medicine to cosmetics to pollution management, et cetera. And the ABNJ represents around 95% of the habitat occupied by life on Earth in all of its forms. So a very, very important area. Well, you may say, well, that's very nice, but does it affect us? Well, there are areas beyond national jurisdiction close to the Caribbean, and you can see them on the map. So areas beyond national jurisdiction fall outside, beyond a state's exclusive economic zone. And that would include all the water column. So all the water column out here is areas beyond national jurisdiction. And these funny little triangles in here are areas beyond national jurisdiction as well. So the water column there would technically be high seas, but also the seabed and subsoil beyond the limits of continental shelves of coastal states. That would be governed by the International Seabed Authority, but the International Seabed Authority does not have the competence to cover all areas of the proposed agreement. So International Seabed Authority does not have clear jurisdiction over environmental and marine genetic resource issues, et cetera. All right, and as I've said, the areas beyond national jurisdiction or BBNJ agreement may be helpful to us for other reasons as well. All right, so let's look at Antigua and Barbuda. I know someone from Antigua and Barbuda is in the audience, and I warmly welcome her here. But I thought it might be useful to try to put what I'm saying in context, because I've talked about a wide range of things, and I want to sort of dig down and try to apply it. And Antigua and Barbuda is an example that I'm quite familiar with. I worked as a consultant for the Department of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea, DUALAS, to provide an ocean governance report with a co-author for Antigua and Barbuda. And one of the things we looked at was blue economy as part of that study. And I think that for me, it really illustrated the wide range of areas that could fall under blue economy. I thought it might be just fisheries, but when I first started, there were a whole range of areas. And Antigua and Barbuda has addressed this quite progressively. They've established a Department of the Blue Economy in their Ministry of Social Transformation, the Blue Economy, and they've had a comprehensive review of their marine economy. So they had the UK's Commonwealth Marine Economies Program did a marine economy plan for Antigua and Barbuda. They've done a Department of the Blue Economy gap analysis, and the Maritime Economy Plan showed that there was potential in both traditional and non-traditional sectors for the blue economy. And you can see them here in the slide. So traditional bedrock, traditional sectors, energy, obviously in your exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, you could have oil, gas, et cetera. But desalinization to deal with water shortages, shipping and ports would be part of your blue economy, fisheries and aquaculture, tourism, and that would be cruise ships, yachting, beach, all-inclusive hotels, minerals and aggregates. Aggregates, sand is a very valuable resource, both for manufacture, construction, and for other activities. But emerging sectors are the sort of new cutting edge sectors. So energy, there are renewable energy in the oceans, energy storage in the oceans, hydrogen, ocean thermal energy, conversion, seawater air conditioning. This one's quite fun. Seawater air conditioning, you pump cold water from the oceans into buildings on land, and it acts as an air conditioner, and then it's pumped back into the ocean. So it's just a transfer of cold into warm places, and it cools them down. Biopharmaceuticals, this is the marine genetic resources I mentioned. New fisheries and aquaculture, including macroalgae, so we can grow things that we would not traditionally consider aquaculture. Tourism, ecotourism, whale watching is obviously very big in some jurisdictions. Deep sea minerals, And the deep sea minerals could include, for example, deep sea minerals on your continental shelf, your extended continental shelf, which would be the kinds of things you would have in the deep seabed. All right, so you have a whole range of areas and sectors that could be part of your blue economy. Now, but if you're doing all these things, don't you require administrative oversight, coordination between a whole range of government bodies? Traditionally, one government ministry would deal with energy, another with shipping, another with fisheries, etc. So you have all sorts of different ministries. And the answer is yes, you would. And in our study, we looked at the range of government bodies that would be required to implement programs in all of these different sectors, and that would be tasked with oversight. And you can see that there is a very large range. So blue economy actually covers all of this, but ocean governance, et cetera, there are ocean governance ministries and committees. Shipping and ports, you have entities dealing with that, sustainability, environment, fisheries, international relations, and that would be treaty maintenance, et cetera, maritime security, tourism, ocean energy. Now, one of the concerns that anyone looking at this range of ministries would feel is how can a blue economy be managed with all of these different actors being necessary so that it was cohesive and coherent? How can you manage a blue economy so that what is done by one ministry doesn't impact negatively what is being done by another ministry? And it's clear that you need at least one entity. So in Antigua and Barbuda's case, it could be, for example, the Department of the Blue Economy, or it could be another ministry, et cetera. But you have to have an entity that can direct and administer and ensure that there are no conflicts arising between all of these different bodies. And I would recommend that if you're going to have such a body, it should have strong powers, that whatever ministry or department is in charge should have strong statutorily based, so it should be powers concretely expressed in statute with strong coordination and enforcement powers. All right, so that's the governance framework. That's all the different national entities that are working on it. But don't you also need a legal infrastructure? And the example is yes. And so you need a whole range of legislation. And of course, that's one of the challenges is how to coordinate all these different statutes and different authorities, et cetera. And I divide it up into various areas. So you have some legislation dealing with fisheries management, mariculture, maritime security, maritime zones, ocean mining. It would be useful to have a specific statute on ocean mining, especially if you're doing mining on the continental shelf far away from shore. Ocean renewable energy, various statutes are needed for that. Protection and preservation of the marine environment, shipping and ports, tourism, et cetera. So these are just kind of examples. Antigua and Barbuda has these statutes, and these ones I looked at. But every CARICOM member state, any Caribbean state, would have to have a statutory framework to allow formal governance and regulation of the kind of activities in the blue economy. All right, so that is my bird's eye view. So it's just left for me to offer a few conclusions, which is really just summarizing some of the points that I have said already. So the first point is that a blue economy relies upon a multi-sectoral, international, regional treaty framework founded upon the Constitution of the Oceans, UNCLOS, and including a range of additional treaties and non-binding instruments. So you have to have this international legal framework, which I've partly sketched out for you, in order to have appropriate functioning blue economy. But it also requires you to participate in a range of international regional organizations and bodies. Many of these treaties will have bodies that are part of them, and you will have to interact with those bodies. And I also pointed out that there are new areas for blue economy activity that we may not have thought of that are emerging. So new technologies, new governance arrangements, the future BBNJ agreement and its provisions on marine genetic resources, access and benefit sharing, capacity building, transfer of marine technology. All of these things can be part of the blue economy. And although there's no, commercialization, immediate commercialization plans for marine genetic resources, and these things take a while to develop, some of the most interesting developments are found in are derived from genetic resources. and the marine genetic resources on the planet far overshadow any land-based genetic resources. So this is a very important area for us to protect and conserve and understand, rather than do what humans unfortunately do, which is eradicate species without even knowing too much about them. All right, and then for Caribbean states to successfully develop blue economies, you need strong interministerial coordination. I would suggest a single entity in a state provided with a comprehensive oversight function over the blue economy. And then you need significant policy and legislative development strengthening. So you can have revision and creation of new laws, but also new policies. I haven't talked about that as much in the talk, but you would need to do that as well, so that the blue economy is runs effectively. All right. So, and to give you just a simple example, say you're using, as part of your blue economy, you're mining your beaches for aggregates, for sand. That could have impacts upon sea turtles, that could have impacts upon land erosion. So you need a legislative framework, and you need an interministerial or intergovernmental, intra-governmental framework that would allow you to check any negative implications of some positive blue economy actions you're doing in one area, which should have negative implications for another. All right, that's my presentation. I know that was a lot, and I tried to do it quickly so as to leave some time for questions. Janice knows I speak quickly, so that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Doctor. We had a real, very comprehensive set of presentations today. As you can see from the audience, we managed to retain most of them, although we've gone over the time, and from just the spontaneous emojis of clapping, we know that we have made the mark and certainly met the mark. So thank you all for enlightening us on the regimes, both management and legal regimes, sort of framing the discussion and the reality of the development of the blue economy. Just to remind, and there we go, today's session. So excellent, thanks for the presentation. So I don't need to add, the audience is saying what we feel. Just to remind the participants that tomorrow we begin making the transition from the regional and the scientific and the management into this field of trade. So I wonder if, if we juxtapose any more rules, if we'll kind of confuse people even more, because it seems to be such a fragmented, regime for the governance of the blue economy. But we're moving into that sphere of thinking about how trade intersects with the blue economy. We will be regaled by presentations from UNCTAD, from the IISD, I believe also from the WTO professionals. So you don't want to miss it, everyone. And also please, please, please encourage others who have signed up and registered to join us at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So on behalf of Dr. Wilkinson and myself, thank you all for joining us on day 2. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Dr. Wilkinson, anything from you?
No, I'll keep it short because I know that we're over time, but incredible day. Thanks to our presenters. It was really rich, informative presentations and discussion. Thank you everyone to their kind of contributions for questions also. And we look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow.
Bye, everyone. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Doctor.